Well, hi everybody, and welcome to Biotensegrity Party. What number are we, Susan?
26.
26.
Right.
And today we have Doug Johnson talking about dynamical diseases, the key to the application of biotensegrity.
Hey,
along with
hi everybody, and welcome.
Along with Dorothea Blaustein. And I am here with my fellow teammates, Susan Lowell, fellow executive producer. Where are you, Susan? Can you say hello? I can't see you.
Hi, I'm here. I got bumped out somehow.
There she is. Hi,
Yeah.
Susan. She's from just outside of Washington, D.C. We
I'm
also have
from
Mariana
inside of
Barreto
Washington,
from
D.C.
Mississauga, Ontario. We have Rachel Tudor tuning in
Hi.
from Tumwater, just outside of Olympia. Hi, Rachel.
Hi.
And Lisa Babiak. Where are you, Lisa? There's Lisa. She is from Prince Albert in Alberta. And we
Hi, everybody.
are very excited to be here with all of you. So let us start with our toast. Now, Sylvia or Doug, who would like to give the toast today?
Or Dorothea?
Go ahead. I need to fix my sound here, so I'm going to step
Sorry,
back.
I'm going to
and
say,
Doug, why don't
in
you give
Washington,
the toast, because I don't see Sylvia on my screen.
Sylvia. Well, what about Dorothea?
All right, let's toast to just the good times we have at these tensegrity parties, and very grateful to have this beautiful fall weather here, and wishing I could send some rain out west to those forest fires.
Oh my
and
gosh.
have a magic wand to fix COVID. And, until then, we can just do our best with positive thoughts and a happy toast.
Thanks, Dorothea. Cheers, everyone, all over.
Cheers. Thank you, Dorothea.
Saúde.
So we like to begin with our sponsors. This wouldn't be happening without the generous sponsorship of many people. And I will invite, doing the sponsors, one of my colleagues to pop on with the sponsors. Rachel.
I think it's Rachel, right?
Oh no, I think it's you, Susan.
Oh, it's not Rachel. I thought you said Rachel. Rachel said something about the
Oh, I think you volunteered to do the sponsors. Are you ready? Or do you
I did. But
she
then
has the link.
Then I needed the script. Well, I'll do it from
Hey,
memory.
Rachel, are
and
you
you'll
ready
help me.
for us?
I was gonna put them in the chat. That's what I was saying.
Oh, that's what you said you were going to
Yeah.
do. Well, anyway, one of our fabulous sponsors is Handspring Publishing, who informed me actually early this morning that I have an advanced copy of my book on the way to me. So everything moves should be ready soon. They're really wonderful to work with. Embodied Biotensegrity, Chris Clancy's educational outfit in the Vancouver area, coming out of Vancouver, has some wonderful programs, and they've been sponsoring us from the beginning. Chris has been our tech mama, so we thank Embodied Biotensegrity. The British Fascist Symposium is another sponsor of ours, and even when they're not doing their symposiums, they're still an active group, so you can check them out. Artifact Pro in Madrid, Spain is another lovely, wonderful sponsor of ours. And Fernando's been really helpful, as a lot of you know, at a lot of these tea parties, and he's got some great models. And both Handspring and Artifact Pro give our tea party participants and friends coupon codes for getting discounts. And then I think Fabiana Silva is here. I see Fabiana. And Fabiana's got the World Fascia Congress coming in a few weeks in Brazil. But it's going to be trilingual. Okay, it's going to be in English, Spanish, and Portuguese, and Steve is speaking. So, and there's a great program up. So we'll put the code for the link for that in there as well. And Elizabeth Larkham, I think, is presenting as well. And I've lost track of all the wonderful presenters. And who did I miss?
I think the only thing you didn't, of the presenters?
Of the sponsors. I did it all from memory.
I know. I think the only thing you didn't mention is that the Biotensegrity Tea Party is a production of the SM11 Biotensegrity Archive.
It is an all volunteer production. So thank you everyone for being here. The fact that you're out there is wonderful, especially if you're new. We love to know who you are and where you are and how you found us and what your interest in biotensegrity is. And even if you've told us before, it takes me a while before I remember everybody. So thank you so much. Back over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Susan. And it feels today a little bit more like a party atmosphere because we had some tech difficulties, so that gets the adrenaline rushing. And it feels fun, actually, to be with you all navigating these challenges with joy rather than with consternation. Now, to move on, I will just repeat that our guests today are Doug Johnson. He's coming to you from Boston, and he is a teacher at Berklee School of Music. Many of you are familiar with Doug. He's been a featured guest as before on the Biotensegrity parties. Sharing body mapping was the really big one with Melanie Sever. And then Dorothea Blostein is coming to you from Kingston, Ontario, a fellow Canadian. And she's also going to be part of the presentation today. Hi, Dorothea. Doug, do you want to take it away? Can you, there we go.
Yes.
Actually, before you do that, I'm going to jump in and let everybody know that we are monitoring the chat here and on YouTube for questions, and we'll be gathering them and bringing them to Doug and Dorothea after their presentations. So please do not hesitate to put your questions in there, your comments. The dialogue that's going on here on Zoom in the chat box is great for building community. And also at this point, I see many of you have turned off your video. We find that when we turn off our videos, except for our key speakers at this point, it gives a really great presentation for the people who are on YouTube. So thanks all. Now you can take it away, Doug.
Okay, yes, thank you very much. Happy to be back and see so many friends. I hope to meet you all in person one day, but it's nice to see people regularly every week on these great tensegrities. So the subject I want to share with you today to talk about is this concept of dynamical diseases. And I guess I just want to say at the beginning, this isn't pure science, and it's not, I haven't gone and done a lot of research on what's in PubMed about a lot of things. This is much more my experience with this material, and I want to share with you my understanding such as it is, and what really resonates with me and what I do in my practice. And this also, the interface is with a couple of wonderful, very extended conversations I've had with Steve, and it was really telling him about what my main interests are and my understanding, my focus. He told me about this concept of dynamical diseases, and it really seemed to be the key to a lot of things that we do. And that sentence, which actually I think I'll just share my PowerPoint now. Yeah, so this is something Steve has said, that dynamical disease, the key to the application of biotensegrity. So all the science and all of the theoretical information that we've been learning, there's this interface that connects to the understanding of the practice that most everyone has. I mean, I think most, if not everybody in the room, are movement people, or are teachers, educators, therapists, manual therapists, coaches, and this obviously this model resonates, but this is really the interface. This understanding of dynamical diseases is really the interface between the theory and the application. There we go. Yeah, so my main goals today is to, that first thing is just hopefully that sentence, code of C is the key, that dynamical diseases, that model is the key to the application of biotensegrity. I hope that makes much more sense at the end of this than it might right now. And if you've already heard of these ideas, I hope we can just go a little deeper with it, perhaps. One of the other goals is to move towards a common framework. There's so many different practices that we have, and there are different vocabularies associated with what we do, different philosophies, different lineages, but clearly we're all coming together because we know there is a central, we resonate with a central idea of biotensegrity, and perhaps we can find ways of talking about what we do in a way that gets a common vocabulary and common understanding, and start discussion. And I know with this group, it won't be hard to start a discussion. So first of all, to look at, ultimately look at dynamical diseases, it's helpful to know something by its opposition or its opposite. So the allopathic medical model, or the traditional disease model, is the one that we're most familiar with. And prior to the connection of autopsies and pathological studies of patients that died with certain symptoms, there were many theories as to what was going in the body, such as imbalances of humors and all sorts of things. But at some points, and I don't have all the history here, but there was over hundreds of years that the association between clear pathological changes with clear symptoms was revolutionary in the understanding of disease processing in medical science. I mean, I remember reading about in Vienna, there was one point where Vienna was the center of medicine kind of before the turn of the century, 1900. So I think about 1820 to 1900, that was the center of medical knowledge and growth, and everybody went to study there that really wanted to learn medicine. And one of the main reasons it was the center is there was the head of pathology and the head of medicine were very close, and there was this constant cooperation when somebody died with particular symptoms. It was cataloged, and then there was an autopsy done. So there was a lot of groundbreaking work to really identify clear pathology with symptoms. And essentially the pathology that's found is the disease. So if there was nodules on the kidneys, that was that clearly is a problem. And cancers, all sorts of things that can be seen clearly. And what was initially pathology in terms of gross observation also includes microscopic studies and biochemical changes, but once again, a clear association with a change and a pattern of symptoms. Another aspect of traditional diseases is they have a clear course. So how long a disease lasts, how it starts, and the way that the healing takes place happens in a predictable linear way. It also can be quite localized, and an easiest way to look at it is an injury is also, we can consider it in the same model. If you have a broken leg, it's clear what's going on and where it's broken, and the symptoms are local. Not to say, of course, that it's not going to affect our whole system, but looking at that as that's the problem and it needs to be fixed, it's a very localized issue. And this is another example I just mentioned, broken bones. It's pretty clear how long a broken bone is going to take to heal. And other I don't think many associated therapies are going to change that kind of trajectory. I broke my leg when I was a kid, and it was 3 months they said I'd be walking, and I was, and it was a pretty clear course. Another example is pneumonia. There are various causes for pneumonia, but it causes changes to the lungs, and there's a certain time that recovery is going to be expected to happen, and that's pretty consistent from patient to patient. Cuts, same kind of thing. Infections, the same kind of thing. And we can bring in medical treatment as well. If there's a certain infection, a bacterial infection, and it's responsive to antibiotics, then that's a very clear linear response to that treatment. And in each one of these cases, there's a clear issue in terms of causality, and then it can be dealt with clearly. And this, my brother is now retired, but general surgeon, and I was actually a nurse in one of my past lives, and I was asking him questions about different surgeries, and I think it was related to this kind of thing. But I said, like, what's the best surgery? You know, like with no complications and it works well every time. And so I'm sure you're aware of pyloric stenosis, but it's the valve, the exit valve from the stomach into the small intestine, and a certain percentage of infants are born with that valve essentially closed. And so things they can't get any nutrition, can't get any fluids, and without treatments, all of these children will die. And with treatments, it's apparently a very quick, easy surgery, and there's basically zero complications, and they all do perfectly well and recover. And that would be a wonderful thing if all medical conditions were like that, that the problem was super clear and easy to identify and super clear and easy to treat, and then you just felt much better afterwards. But obviously, everything isn't like that. So some challenges to the traditional disease model. Asthma is a good example. And I feel like I should just footnote Steve here. I mean, a lot of these examples I am taking from conversations we've had, and so I will just want to credit him there. So asthma is a very good example that there's a clear process happening when there's an asthma attack, but after the attack is over, you can't look at the lungs and say, oh yeah, there was something that happened there, and that's clearly what was the problem. It's not a matter of that clarity of a process that's identifiable, that you can identify in terms of pathology. Whereas once again, a lung issue like pneumonia is. So they're both related to the lung, but they're very different. Back pain is another interesting one. And this is a case where you can find pathology, but that pathology can be basically a red herring. So you can have somebody with presenting with back pain, and they might not have any evidence of any issue on an X-ray. You can have an X-ray that shows some spinal compression, some discompression, and a person might not have any symptoms at all. But you can have somebody with symptoms that has an X-ray that's positive and shows some discompression, and then they receive some treatments and their symptoms go away, and they take an X-ray and there hasn't been any change in the discompression. And so even though using that medical model, that traditional disease model, it makes sense to look for a pathological change, and you can find it and think that there's evidence then for the problem. But in this case, it isn't so clear. It's not like an appendicitis or that pyloric stenosis. And musculoskeletal issues in general are complicated and more difficult to deal with, more likely to be chronic and not responsive to traditional therapies. And we can have ideas of inflammatory processes and things, but it certainly isn't so clear cut as some of those other examples, like an infection that you can treat with an antibiotic. I was working we were talking about doing a research project, but it was a rheumatologist at Tufts who's also a researcher. And he said, just very unequivocally, he said, medicine doesn't do very well with musculoskeletal issues. It's challenging. There's this very interesting physician that Steve trained with, and it would be great to hear him talk more about this at any time, but I'll just give you a little rundown. So John Manel was a physician, and he also did manual therapy and manual assessment. I think I'll just turn this off and we can, and these are just 3 books he wrote. But what he assessed was something called joint play, which you may or may not be familiar with the idea, but if we just look at the MP joint here, there's certain ways that the musculature there's a certain range of motion that this finger has in terms of normal motion that the muscles can move this finger through at that joint. But there's also other movement available at that joint. We just can't access it with the muscles in this hand. And joint play is involving those other movements. And you might as well just try this on yourself. If you distract that finger, that first phalange away from that joint, you'll be able to create a little space in that joint, or a little more space in the joint. That's one range of joint play. If you have that bone slightly distracted, you can also rotate it on its own axis. And that's another level of joint play, another type of joint play. And if you distract it, you can also slide it up and down a little bit. Can't remember the term for that, but at any rate, those different types of specific movement, that joint play is required for that joint to be able to move in its normal range. And so what Steve learned from him is how to do these assessments, really painstaking, long assessments where you really go through all of the joints in the body, or certainly in a region, to find out where there are restrictions. And if you find restrictions, then there's manipulations to re-establish that joint play. And from what Steve was saying, one of the things that became clear is this was, this doesn't fit particularly well in that traditional disease model. It's not a pathological change, it's a functional change, I think we could say. And what is so interesting is how a small change in a restriction of maybe one aspect of that joint play could have effects in other parts of the body, could have global effects, systemic effects. And with that small change in finding that little bit of joint play, then it wouldn't be just necessarily that joint became more mobile, but there was a region of the body became more free, more mobile, and potentially changes in other parts of the body. And for the kind of therapy and all the things people do in this group, I know that concept's not surprising, but for looking at the body strictly in terms of that traditional disease model, it's pretty surprising. And for a lot of people, that kind of thing still is surprising. Just go back to share. So these are just a couple sentences from his writing that just, I think, say this really beautifully. Voluntary movements cannot be achieved unless certain well-defined movements of joint play are present. It is the summation of movements of joint play and movement in the voluntary range that make up the movement of the living anatomy. And I mean, whatever else I talk about today, I think this is pretty priceless. And if that really, that specifically stating this is new, then I think it probably will be resonating and interesting for a lot of people. So that second sentence again, it is the summation of movements of joint play. So all those free, that range of motion that's beyond the normal movement in every joint, that movements along with the voluntary range make up every movement in the living anatomy. When I picture that, and as I move, I get a freer and more open picture. It's very interesting. So this other aspect that there might be a restriction in the tibial-talar joints, a little lack of joint play there. I think that one is maybe fairly easy to see how that's going to affect us globally. Could be some mobility in the foot that's lacking, could be in the wrist, could be in any of the hand bones. But there's this idea that a small change somewhere can have a global effect or affect somewhere else that's surprising. And the term for that in terms of systems theory and chaos theory is called sensitive dependence on initial conditions, more popularly known as the butterfly effect, the idea that a butterfly can flap its wings in Brazil and then the weather changes in Paris. And this is a good example of that kind of concept. This is a book by James Gleick, which is really influential in my just subconscious and thinking about a lot of things. And in talking about this stuff with Steve, he said he read this book a long time ago and he really meant a lot to him too. So I thought I should just plug it and share it. Another important factor in Steve coming to this understanding was a paper, I wish I had the date there, but it was called Dynamical Disease by these two neurologists or cardiologists. And what they were finding is there are conditions where periodicity is a normal thing, but there's new periodicities that appear. For instance, this bizarre one where you have a heart dysrhythmia and it just happens regularly every 7 days. And there are mood oscillations that can change rates in bipolar disorder. And there are other conditions that have a kind of rhythmicity that loses that quality. Atrial fibrillation and VFib is another one. But the idea being more generally with this idea that there's not a specific pathology, you're not going to look at somebody and say, well, yeah, you have a problem in this part of your heart conduction system. It's just that there's in the system is a dynamical system that things get a little out of whack, basically. And this idea also relates back to chaos theory, where you can have things that appear regular, like climate, but it isn't actually a strict set point. There's a system where it's absolutely not possible to determine exactly what's going to happen in a system, yet there can be relatively steady states. And certainly climate is an example of that. Yet with certain perturbations, we can move out of a particular steady state into another steady state or into just apparent randomness. And if you think about climate, we've had ice ages that are fairly recent where that we could call it generally a set point was different. So those kind of processes are likely what's happening with these diseases. So some properties of dynamical diseases. Often no clear pathology associated with symptoms. So that's fundamentally different and fundamentally challenging to that whole idea of that traditional model. They're related to dynamical processes in the body. Global systems are involved, I guess that's the same thing. Location of symptoms often does not correspond to the source of the problem. I didn't know what word to put there exactly, but that the Manel kind of joint play idea really demonstrates that clearly, where you can have one place in the body where you can assess a lack of mobility and it's affecting other parts of the body. And unlike that clear course of a disease or problem, with these issues, it's not necessarily so clear. And one of the things that started me down this whole path was years ago when I had some, what the doctor would prefer to call tendinitis, but my symptoms were not so clear cut. I'd have weakness one day, tingling another, a clear point area of pain another day, and then another day the pain would be in my other arm. And expecting a clear pathological change to be associated with all those random symptoms didn't make a lot of sense. Yet my arm would felt when it was bad, like I was definitely injured. So that model seemed to resonate with me, and it felt like I would definitely need weeks or months to heal from that injury. And when I finally saw the right person and I started moving differently, it was a matter of days, and I felt just better, and I felt strong. And that was so baffling. And once again, with the traditional disease model, that just doesn't make sense. But with this dynamical disease process, that while it might not just directly explain it, that framework allows for this kind of course, and that allows us to understand that those things are possible. And as Steve was looking at when he found this paper that said, that idea really is what was going on with the manipulations and the Manel work. And it's a really good way to look at musculoskeletal issues in general. And there's this other aspect that every orthopedic issue has a dynamical disease component. So if somebody does break their leg and has that condition that's going to have this traditional course of recovery, what Steve has said is that there's this associated dynamical disease. So the dynamics of the system are affected by having that injury. And I expect the whole process of having yourself being in a cast for months at a time. And so it's the last thing to recover. After the bone is healed, the dynamics have to be restored. So how are we going to understand this in a biotensegrity framework? So we're looking at the structure of the body, musculoskeletal, neurofascial, muscular skeletal system. And how are we going to assess this? What does a change or disruption of the dynamical processes look like? Once again, the model of having a lack of joint play in one place, and how that might interact with the whole system, we can visualize that. We can sense that internally. How do we assess the system? How do we interrogate the system? How can we affect these processes to restore normal homeodynamics, homeostasis? And that's a little hint of what Dorothea is going to be talking about in a little bit here. A much easier question to ask, since it's a much similar structure, would be a tensegrity structure compared to a full biotensegrity system. And how do we assess a tensegrity? It might very well look like a question that doesn't really make much sense. I mean, a tensegrity just is, right? It's just there. Has certain properties. One question we could ask is, well, what does it do? What's its function? If we can define some way that it has a function, then we could assess how well it's doing its function. So global movement is an emergent property of the materials that make up a tensegrity structure. So if the sticks and cables just on their own don't have any global movement relationship, but when it comes together and there's enough tension in the system that the struts are all suspended, then that property emerges. It's a phase change in the whole system. And at that point, global movement is something that's available. Global movement allows the structure to communicate information. I think of various kinds, but certainly mechanical information. If you move one part, the other parts move. And I think there's a way that movement is both sequential and simultaneous. So we could say a function of the structure is to communicate information. So we can ask, how well does it do that? How well does the structure communicate information? And I just have to stop this again. And I maybe should speed up a little bit. So I think if you've seen me present before, you've seen this model, and the chat room in the past is always filled up with questions about this model. So I'll just say this in front. This was Tom Flemons built this model, and it was a gift, and it was one of the best gifts I've ever gotten. It was, I believe, one of the last models he sold, and I feel incredibly lucky to have it. So looking at this idea of communication, if I move a little bit up here and with really precise directions, vectors, amounts of energy, I can feel it in my hand incredibly clearly. This is springy, but a spring doesn't communicate information like that. So in its normal functional state, it's able to do that very well. But simply put, if I create some sort of disruption, some sort of block, now I have a system that has two regions that perhaps we could say this has some structural integrity in this region and this does down here. But at this point, the signal doesn't go through. At this point, the signal is completely blocked. You can imagine different scenarios where there's a little restriction and then the signal is attenuated. It's weaker, or there's interference and the signal, it's not as clear what's coming through and it's weaker. But once again, it's a kind of phase change between this block and then that release where the signal can then come through. Worth just mentioning briefly, some of you are aware of Michael Turvey's work, and one of the things he describes is that our system, our haptic system, our system of touch, pressure, balance internally, that we have sensors throughout the body, but those sensors aren't just reading something local. They're getting information. I think a picture like sonar buoys that laid out through the ocean, that they're getting information all through our system. And the medium that communicates that information that all those different sensors can read is this resonance of our whole structure. So once again, if there's a block, that's not just going to affect our mobility and our effect to respond in terms of movement, respond in terms of balance and equilibrium, but also the acuity and the clarity of our haptic system. So if I'm holding a violin and my hips are locked, I'm not gonna, it doesn't seem so obvious to people at first, but my hips are locked, I'm not gonna be able to feel the balance of that instrument as clearly. And even just the touch in my fingers, moving from finger to finger on the instrument, I'm not gonna be able to feel that as clearly. Okay. So one of the things that anybody teaching about tensegrity or experiencing is this most basic thing. Tensegrity says one part moves and every part moves. And I expect on some level that the way we resonate with that experience in seeing a model, holding a model, and the way that resonates with our sense of ourselves and our potentials and our sense of what we experience in working with other people. I feel like that's the money, right? That's the place that's the thing that's most exciting. And it's such a simple thing, but it's also so profound. But the reality is in actual bodies, one thing moves and maybe nothing else moves. I can take somebody's arm and their thoracic spine is just totally locked and nothing else happens. One thing moves, some things move, but still a bunch of things not moving. Some things move, but not very freely. One thing moves, but the rest of the system is resistant at best. There's just a stiffness and locking throughout. And also one thing moves and then it just reaches the block. So if I have that hip joint that's just habitually locked, I can move my upper body and spiral into that and I just reach a block. It doesn't reach the base. At Chris's wonderful book club, we one day discussed this Dynamical Disease article. And there were a lot of wonderful comments and really insightful things. And I just decided to take this one with Mary Jane's permission, but from Mary Jane Porter. I work in a dynamic manner. For me, the whole dynamics is the exchange of information. I think it just, that cuts to the core of it. The way thinking about how a model can communicate information or have trouble, the same in the body. So for me, the whole dynamics is the exchange of information. I map and I go through the fascial matrix doorway. I look for noise, I look for disturbances, and I look for these lost rhythms of oscillations. That's all about dynamical systems, which shows me that there is a change in the dynamics of information exchange at that point in time. She speaks like she could just write a book. That's just perfectly said. My good friend Melanie Seaver sent me a quote related to this, and I said, "Who said it?" And she said, "You said it." So I'm reluctant to quote myself, but it kind of, I think, is spot on with this. If we can solve the communication problem, we can resolve the dynamical disease. So the key to the application of biotensegrity. And back to that comment of Steve's, that sentence of Steve's. So understanding this dynamical disease system is the key to the application of biotensegrity. And one thing that's interesting to me is it wasn't just the key to treating knee pain or something like that. Think about all the different things that people in this community do, from doctors and orthodontists to manual therapists of a variety of kinds, and movement educators, and also to coaches working with Olympic athletes. I've had a number of people over the last few years, when they find out I teach piano, they're like, "Why are you here exactly?" And but it's interesting. So applications apply to all these things, and let's look into that a little more. So we're looking at disruptions of the dynamics of the system and how that impacts function. And what I want to consider here, and to me, this is really one of the most important parts of what I wanted to get across today, is even though this is called the dynamical disease model, which implies that it's just about some sort of problem, we could also, this kind of relates to the whole change of, instead of talking about disease, talking about health. And I think it's that same kind of continuum. We have this continuum from dysfunction in the sense that it's causing problems that people want to address. It hurts. I want it to go away. I want it to be better. I'm not able to do certain activities that I used to be able to do, and I'd like to deal with that. So that we could define dysfunction in a sense roughly that way. Normal, healthy function. So you're basically healthy. You don't have any complaints, and you're comfortable doing the activities that you want to do. But on the other hand, we get to Wilbur and the kind of work some of us are doing, working with musicians, that we're looking really to optimize function. Susan teaching Tai Chi, there's really optimizing function. And what I want to, once again, is to consider that even though this term dynamical disease is out there, we're talking about this continuum, and we can understand all of it through the same frame. Yeah, so that's basically, those are some of the people that are here and that I was describing. I really like this idea of getting rid of pain is not the end, it's the beginning. So often that what needs to be learned to move differently, to release a certain area of blockage or release restrictions, that same process continuing is the same thing that's going to help us feel even healthier, feel stronger, and also perform better, if that's what we're looking for. So one thing I want you to, we're going to try a little movement exercise here. So there are different emerging properties that we talk about, And sense of weightlessness or lightness is, in my understanding, an emergent property. Something Carol was describing last week. I think it came up 3 or 4 times that when she's working with the clients and there's a communication in the system is established or reestablished, the patient, the client will remark on how much healthier they feel, but also this is, she kept using this phrase, it was beautiful, that I feel lighter, I feel a sense of lightness. And I expect a lot of people can relate to that in some way. So I'm just going to, I wonder if we should have people turn on their cameras for this. But at any rate, just please do this along with me. Thank you, great. What I'm gonna ask you to do is, you're gonna have a student hand and a teacher hand. And I basically want you to pick up your hands. I'm gonna do it there with my right, pick up my left hand and right out to the fingertips. So I'm carrying the fingertips, all 5, thumb through little finger. And if I just move my hand would drop. But in this position, if I move my hand like that, and just the fingers are going to drop. So they're that loose. And the game we're going to play here, the mind game we're going to play here, is just deal with that little finger. So if I move my finger underneath, that finger is going to drop. But think right out at the fingertip. So you're supporting it there. Just make a choice that if you move this finger, that finger doesn't drop. So, and it might take a certain amount of intention or energy or effort, but it's remarkable how just ultimately just making a choice that it doesn't fall or drop, you can achieve that. So as you move your finger, that supporting finger, that finger will just float. What I want you to do is move sequentially through the finger. So as you move to the 4th finger, make sure the 5th finger still is making that choice. And then just make a choice that the 4th finger doesn't drop, and the 3rd finger, and the 2nd finger, and ultimately the thumb just doesn't drop. And what you'll find is after you take your hand away, even though you've just made a choice about what's happening with the tips of the finger, the whole arm is floating. I didn't say hold up your arm or hold up your wrist. It's just a choice about what's happening out here. And then put your other hand under your arm while you still are making a choice about those fingers just not dropping even the tiniest amount, and just guide your arm around a little bit with your other finger. And what you'll most likely find is there's a real sense of buoyancy. It's not that you're lifting dead weight up and that you're letting it drop. I always think of that those architectural lamps that have spring loaded, you know, when you lift it up, the springs kind of move it. And now with your arm up just a little bit and feeling that sense of buoyancy, let your fingers, let the ends of the fingers just drop a little bit. And you can make it more exaggerated by just letting your hand drop at your wrist. See what happens in your upper arm and see what happens to that sense of weightlessness. I expect for most of you, you're gonna have a sense that your arm's pretty heavy right now and you don't wanna stay here very long. And just return back to that choice about the fingertips just not dropping and see if you can find a different organization. Doing this with a student once, they said, there's just one muscle. That was their experience of this. There's just one muscle. But if you drop your hand, you can go to an anatomy text and you can say, well, it's my anterior deltoid that's lifting my arm. And when I drop my hand, now that's my experience of it. It's all the work's there. It's getting tired really fast. But yet, when I make another choice, a functional choice, then all that work is distributed through the entire system and I have that sense of lightness. I hope you all did sense that. And I just want to show you an example of how this might be a functional, how this might function. So this is Vladimir Horowitz, and this will repeat a couple of times, but I want you to notice is how he's doing that exact thing that we were just talking about with the fingertips not dropping, and especially his left hand is floating above the keys. And just considering that the way he's choosing to use his hand is triggering that phase change, is triggering that response that is allowing him to have that sense of weightlessness and connecting him to all the power. Right there, floating across. Okay. Yeah, if he dropped his fingers as he went along the keys, he wouldn't be able to play like that. He wouldn't be able to move like that. So some other examples of where this kind of functional pattern exists is Aikido and Tai Chi, Brishnikov and Fontaine, not John Fontaine. And it exists here in extension and here in flexion, but stimulating that same response. And most beautiful example. Okay, just coming up to the end here. How do we assess a biotensegrity? One of the ways that might be, whoops, sorry. One of the ideas that might be controversial in ways is that the system does have these emergent properties. And when we learn about the pure science of it, the theory, we just say that this is a property of the structure. But I hope it's clear that there's sometimes where those apparently emergent properties recede. And so global movement is an emergent property, but we can lose that. Communication goes right along with that. Auxeticity is a property of tensegrities. But if a really good example is Alexander technique in a really effective lesson and response, the result is the back lengthens and widens, which implies that if it's really lengthening and widening, we are having that auxetic response and that feeling of weightlessness comes in. But it implies too that I must not have been having that response before. And if my back is shortening and narrowing, that's a different response. Equal tonus, sense of weightlessness, and okay, one video to play, and then we'll go to Dorothea, which I'm looking forward to very much.
So, and we are going to do some exciting project. Exciting project is we're going to try to heal the tensegrity, the buckled tensegrity tower with the use of a little bit of inventiveness.
Now I'm going to decrease the tension in one of the struts, the compression elements of the tensegrity tower. We should point out that this, just because I shortened this, that doesn't mean it's a bone that's shortened. This wouldn't represent a bone. This represents internal forces within the system.
Absolutely. So this is our buckling system. You know, I'm going to test it from above. And what happens? So now we see that it starts collapsing on itself in the middle. So it doesn't transfer that oscillation so effectively at the bottom, right?
Correct.
So
it doesn't jiggle like the other one does on the bottom.
So what we're going to try to do, this is the first time experiment, you know, so we're going to try to use the wraps, you know, let's say, I shall say, you know, let's say biotensegrity inspired wraps, right? So biotensegrity inspired wrap as the means of also adding some compressional elements, right? So some compressive elements to heal the tensional uniformity. Well, I haven't done this before since I've never had that. So let's see what we're going to get. So now, first of all, I'm going to now reverse the thing and say, well, what are the things that we're doing in the humans? So our first thing is to meet them exactly where they are with their current tensional weakness, right? So you see, therefore, my first point would be to get it there, to get it around, at the level of the minimal tension, and we'll see what we can get. And now I will probably have to connect it a little bit further.
And I would go up to the next level too.
I will have to connect it there. I will have to connect it there. And wait a second. So you see, at this point, I'm not doing any specific extra tightening. I met it at the weakest point. You know, I wasn't doing any particular.
I would go up to this
Yeah,
level.
no, they see, but that's where that's fully agreed.
Okay.
Fully agreed. Just kind of trying to do this in the ecological fashion, so that it will kind of follow the chirality of the structures, so that we get it in a more natural way. All right, things are starting to look better. Biotensegrity healing process. So now you see it calls for some. You see, this is where we used only the tensional elements. So now we have an opportunity to, you know, which already gave us some improved transferring properties. So, but now we're going to try to use the compressive elements, integrate the compressive elements into it, so trying to save it further. And actually this is a very interesting cross-pollination of the ideas between the models and the real life, you know, because you start getting this stuff. And you see also what happens that once we added this compressive element, we got the new level to hook. Right? So you see now we get the new tension lines, which so you see, like for instance, with this egg inserted here, what was difficult for me to come up all the way to the third level, so suddenly this becomes easy. So I can naturally install, you know, this thing, and then probably I would add now the counterbalancing piece here. But you see, it's also, if I'm over tensioning, then it becoming, you know, distorted and becomes, then I get the accumulation of the internal forces that I'm not really looking for. So I'm going to redistribute it into the egg. All right. And now we're going to get one more, I guess, compressive element here. Let's see how that is going to give us the healing powers. All right, you know, that goes nicely at the bottom. You know, we get another cross section here. Oops. And we get to the top. And actually, I think that right now, the thing is getting, is already getting much better.
A lot.
So that's, well, you know, it screams for another compressive element there, just to get it in. And we still have a lot of wrap to go. And then, but it's amazing how this thing offers its own logic, right?
Yeah, that's the nice thing about it, is that you can feel what needs to be done.
So the treatment process changes during the processes. You become aware of what's...
Yeah, absolutely. So you see, but this is the thing, that you're looking for the tensional uniformity. Yeah. How is that?
Yeah, now you can see the lower ones that are
Yeah, you
reacting,
can
and
see
you want to react to before.
Yeah, and you can see that the chirality is being restored. Wow, look at that. That's incredible. Wow, isn't it?
Beautiful.
That's great.
Okay. I love that. I mean, I feel like that really shows a lot of these principles. When just by changing just by changing the length of one strut, the top of that structure and the bottom of that structure cease to communicate. And so one of the things that Brad Fullerton mentioned, and I think Steve had said to him, that don't address the injury, address the dynamics. And instead of them trying to fix the strut, they looked at the dynamics of the structure and addressed that, and with the technique that they had available. And just a couple other things, that that it, as Lena said, it presents its own logic. And one of the things I wanted to mention is, how do we assess the system? Ultimately, we are the resonators that have the capacity to understand what's happening in the black box, in that indeterminate system, but we're the resonators that have the potential to assess that. And both these scientists were ultimately using their intuition. I love how Steve says you can sense it, you can feel it. And that's, I think that's a great way to wrap this up. And Dorothea is going to talk about how we could possibly model this kind of balance in the system, and she's got some great stuff about that.
Okay, so can I share my screen? Yes, here. Share screen. Okay, this one here. Slideshow, play from start. Okay, so I'll try to keep this somewhat brief since it's already after 2 o'clock and we would love to have some time for discussion. If you see things here you would like to comment on, my email address is up at the top, blostein@cs.queensu.ca. I'm talking today about ideas that I published in Journal of Bodywork and Movement Therapies in 2016. The title of that article was Simulation of Abstract Models of Structural Homeostasis. And the basic thing I was trying to address there was that, as we all know, body structure adapts in response to demands you put on the body. There's, response to injury and response to athletic training and all sorts of things. The adaptations occur at many different time scales and spatial scales. How can we model this? And even though I use the term structural homeostasis in the title of the article, I was aware that homeostasis is not such an ideal word. It's very widely used, so I was using it there. But in the article, I suggested that homeokinetics would be a better term than homeostasis, because homeokinetics suggests that what's going on is that the body is balancing processes in time rather than maintaining a fixed steady state. And I had heard this term homeokinetics from Michael Turvey, who Doug actually already mentioned his work in haptic sense. So I thought that was a great term, but it turns out I just did a PubMed search and almost no one else has been using the term homeokinetics. So there's this related term homeodynamics that is more widely used. There were maybe 120 PubMed hits for homeodynamics. So I'm switching to that term. But in this talk, I have some quotes from literature where people still use the term homeostasis, but maybe over time we can migrate to the homeodynamics term. And then it kind of makes sense too to say something that we call a dynamical disease is some kind of injury or malfunction or non-idealness in the homeodynamics. We have the term dynamic in both. Okay, so body structure adapts. It adapts to support efficient movement. So if you repeatedly ask your body to do sprinting, your structure adapts to make you a faster sprinter. If you do a lot of this one-sided asymmetric rowing, then your body will adapt to, maybe in asymmetric ways to make you particularly strong that way. The body responds globally to local injury. The body responds to support posture efficiently. So unfortunately, in today's society, if you spend a lot of your time asking your body to let you stare at a computer screen like this, it will adapt to make you efficient at doing that. So how do we model a homeodynamic system? Well, really, we know that our entire organism, our entire body self-regulates as a whole. And actually, we're kind of one with the environment. The whole world is self-regulating as a whole. But in the terminology we find in PubMed and elsewhere, we arbitrarily divide this into homeostatic systems. So as you may guess from me frequently mentioning PubMed, I like to go there and do searches for how people are using different terms. So in PubMed, you can find lots of hits for these various things. Calcium homeostasis, tendon homeostasis, ligament homeostasis, bone homeostasis. And a lot of those, I really wish I could just grab those authors and ask them, you know, like you say tendon homeostasis in your article, what do you mean by that? And, you know, what's the homeostatic goal and how would you define that? And I'm 100% certain that the authors would not be able to fully define this. They're a little vague at the edges about what they themselves mean, but still that you can find lots of articles about this. So generally, to model a homeodynamic system, you would need to define some model of the body and some model of the demands placed on the body. So that would be the environment, and some definition of the homeodynamic mechanisms and processes there's a bunch of different mechanisms or processes, whatever you want to call them. They occur, some are very short term, some are longer term, some are small scale, some are large scale. And they're all going on at once, and they all have their own rhythms, and they all interact in our whole sense of health and well-being and movement and whatever arises as an emergent property from the interaction of these many different processes. And that's a very complicated system. So we can make simplified models where we just say, well, let's pretend we know we have these, and these processes, and we'll just simulate and see what happens. And that would be a very simplified approximation to the complexity of what's really going on in a body. When I wrote the paper 4 years ago, I had listed that we could try to define the homeostatic goal. I put that in brackets here because that's actually very hard to define, and it's sort of mistaken too, because it implies that there's one fixed goal you're aiming for, but certainly the goal is a moving target due to changing demands placed on the body. That, you know, every second our environment changes, so our homeostatic goal changes. So rather than trying to, even in very simplified models, I think it's kind of a non-ideal approach to try to define the homeostatic goal and how to measure distance from the goal, and to phrase it as though the system has a goal to try to reduce, that is working to try to reduce that distance. All that stuff is very hard to do. Instead, it's better, I think, to just focus on trying to define this set number 3, all these different homeodynamic processes that are occurring at different time scales and spatial scales. You try to define those processes, and then you have to define how these processes are triggered and how they interact and so on. And then what people traditionally might have called the homeostatic goal would kind of arise as an emergent property from that. So for structural homeodynamics, the body model you would need would focus on generation and propagation of forces, and you would specify injury thresholds, things like that. Demands placed on the body, you could specify external forces applied over time or movement requirements. So if you require your body to be able to move like this guy, it will make the necessary adjustments. I find this fellow very impressive. And the core to the modeling for getting better understanding of the structural homeodynamics is to define the interacting set of processes that affect the body structure. And there's so many of these processes, many of them are cyclic and a huge range of time and spatial scales. So I now have 2 slides with examples. I will go through these very quickly to not take too much time, but I suggest if you have reactions to this, I'd love to hear from you in email, and I'll just leave it up here briefly. You can read the scale in the video. You can read the slide. Okay, so the reason I'm putting up this example is because thermal homeodynamics sounds relatively simple, that we say, you know, measuring body temperature it's relatively well defined. It's easier to wrap your head around the structural homeodynamics where it's harder to define, what are movement requirements and so on. And I just found it interesting to look at phrases describing thermal homeostasis. I will focus only on this one here, where there was this publication in Obesity Review 2011, where they talk about thermogenic capacity. And that's like a well-defined and interesting idea for thermal homeodynamics. It's just how robust is the system? How much extra heat is it able to generate? And I find it very thought-provoking and interesting to think of, okay, that's an analogy. Now we want to talk about structural homeodynamics. How would we define the equivalent of thermogenic capacity? And that kind of relates to, can the person just barely manage to do the movements they need to do, or is there a lot of excess movement space? And it would be very interesting to have discussions to try to define these things. And again, to model thermal homeodynamics, you would have to have a body model focused on thermal mass of different tissues and heat transfer and so on. And you could make up homeodynamic processes important in response to cold. You have vasoconstriction, shivering, and longer term, there would be fat deposition. If you're ever interested in cold water swimming, I hugely recommend this book, Swimming to Antarctica by Lynn Cox. She was able to swim in 0 degrees Celsius water, so 32 degrees Fahrenheit. She was able to swim in water that would have killed anyone else. And she was also willing to support science and swim in a cold water tank with a rectal thermometer up or behind and all sorts of measurement stuff. And they found that as she swam in very cold water, her core temperature actually went up rather than down. And she was just, it's an amazing book. The second example I had was nervous system homeodynamics. Again, I want to move through this quickly because of our lack of time here. But so these are publications in PubMed. People are writing about network homeostasis in the nervous system is more than the sum of single neuron homeostasis, and the existence of network-wide regulation rules for homeostatic control. All of these things I think are interesting for us to look at and think about and say, well, what would be the equivalence for structural homeodynamics? We have people often publish about fascial networks. So we have the nervous system, neural networks and fascial networks. And here people are publishing papers about network homeostasis in the nervous system, and we can try to think about sort of similar ideas for network homeostasis in the fascial network. And I think the ideas the nervous system people have had could help us, and our ideas might help the nervous system people because they know they have a long way to go to really fix all their modeling to, no one really understands sleep and learning and memory fully. So we have a lot more to do there. And then there's also publications that talk about if you can get better understanding of the homeostatic functions in the brain, then that gives you conceptual advances for the treatment and so on. And analogous statements can be made for structural homeodynamics, for biotensegrity homeodynamics. Okay, so nearing the end here, I'm suggesting that I love this video of Tom Fleming's pelvis model. And there's also one over here of a leg model. These models are amazingly wonderful tools for study. They're clearly hugely simplified. I think it's a mistake to refer to these as biotensegrity models. It's much more accurate to call them tensegrity biomimicry. That's what Tom called them himself, because they're enormously oversimplified compared to the real biotensegrity. Where in the biotensegrity, as you know, it's at many different spatial scales, and it wouldn't be enough to have just 100 struts and cables. But these simple models do capture something interesting. So despite their simplicity, they're still very interesting. And so you could study how these models respond. Oh, oops, that ends up ugly. And you could do some experiments with it where you can have injuries, whereas things like cutting a strut, it might in certain situations be roughly equivalent to, or might be a useful analogy to what happens when you break a bone or you cut a cable, might be in some cases similar to tearing a ligament, or you glue two cables together, might be similar to forming an adhesion. You can experiment with it in different ways. So to work with this, with physical models, it's hard to come up with materials that will adapt and change over time. But with computer simulation, you could actually simulate one of these models and then have adaptive processes that are running there that over time this model changes its properties in response to whatever it experiences. So you could just make a simple computer algorithm rule to say that cables stiffen and struts strengthen in response to loading. So when you have like oops, okay, I can play this thing again here. Here, Tom Flemons is manually poking at that stick up there to make this model walk around. And as he does these movements, these individual struts and cables over time are feeling more or less stress through them. And so you could have a system where you simulate you make this model do certain kinds of movements over and over and over, and then it could adjust its properties. It could change the resting length or tension of some of the cables, or it could change the strength of some of the struts, and so on. And that would be an abstract way of representing all of these well-known short-term and long-term changes in body stiffness that I've mentioned here. Like, I love the title of this: Gracility of the Modern Homo sapiens Skeleton as the Result of Decreased Biomechanical Loading. There's been lots of study of that. Now, if you want to make a simulation like this, clearly if you're having some rules where cables stiffen, you need to have counteracting rules that cables become less stiff in response to something or other. And I think there's very interesting open questions for how to model it, but what I'm calling autonomic movement here, pendiculation in particular, the stretch-yawn reflex. There's been a very interesting publication by Fernando Bertolucci about the possible healthful roles of how stretch-yawn helps maintain the health of our biotensegrity system, and also the fact that our society frowns on yawning as rude, so people over decades suppress the urge to yawn and stretch, and that may have bad effects on them. I was also very impressed that in 2010, there was a first international conference on yawning, and I was just very impressed that the organizers of this conference were willing to call this conference on yawning, because they know that they're making themselves open for the butt of jokes, that people will just think, well, yawning is just inherently this joke. But they could have called it a first international conference on pendiculation, and then people would have said, I don't know what pendiculation is, so this sounds more important. But in any case, it's clear that yawning is not a joke. I think it's the physiological role of yawn stretch is ill understood. Just talking about it makes me want to start yawning. It has these interesting things, like it's kind of catching. You see someone who's yawning and you want to yawn. And it's very highly conserved in evolution, so it must perform some important health promoting function. And I think it's similar to how sleep is not very well understood for why is sleep necessary for the nervous system, why is stretch yawn necessary for our biotensegrity myofascial system. They're both ill understood, but it's nice to see that people are studying it. And then there's a sort of related class of spontaneous movements. Spontaneous movements arise in a lot of places. I have a summary table I could share with people who are interested. Here's a quick summary of the summary table. This summary table is created by Budiman Minasni in, I hope I'm not mispronouncing his name. He's a good friend, but I never heard him pronounce his name. This was about 4 or 5 years ago. He had compiled all these lists of manual therapies, movement therapies, and spiritual practices where spontaneous movements arise. and they somehow help to maintain body structure. So I'm discussing with Fernando Bertolucci. He's the author of this publication here. He's a physiatrist in Brazil, and he does manual therapy that he used to call muscle repositioning, and then he renamed it tensegrity touch, and there's a lot of spontaneous movements arise in the clients there. I'm also discussing it with Joel Began, a physiotherapist in New Hampshire, and Joel is actually here joining us today, the first time he's actually in live at one of our Biotensegrity meetings. So I'll end here with this one quote from that I found in a very interesting paper that Doug just sent me a few days ago. So I highly recommend this paper. It's called Why Homeodynamics, Not Homeostasis, published in 2001. It gives an interesting review historically of all kinds of, there's many interesting ideas in there. And one thing they mention there is this quote from 1950 from this guy, von Berklee, I don't know how to pronounce these. Anyway, what he says is what are called structures are slow processes of long duration. Functions are quick processes of short duration. So actually the way we can think of our own body, we can think of, well, we have these structures like we have bones and we have fascia and whatever. And in this view here, all of those are just, we think of them as physical structures because they're slow processes of long duration. And you could actually make the same statement about our continents. We think of North America and Australia and Europe and whatever, these continents as these fixed structures, but we know that over geological time, they're actually all shifting and moving. And so everything in our body and in the whole environment can be viewed in terms of these processes at different time scales and spatial scales that are all interacting in sometimes chaotic ways, and somehow emergent out of there are these things that used to be called homeostasis. So that's what I wanted to say, and then hopefully we can have some discussion here. I should now stop screen sharing. Okay, thank you.
Shall we invite everybody who hasn't turned their camera on to put it on now?
Okay.
Thank you both. That was fascinating. And Dorothea, it would be great to be able to dive into that a bit further at some point in the future. Doug, do you want to take it away from here, or do you want me to ask questions?
Let me see. Maybe a combination.
Okay, well, right now we've just got a couple of questions that are up.
Yeah, and then people can maybe just jump in. But Patricia, do you want to ask your question or?
Sure. I think that maybe Dorothea answered my first question. It was just sort of a, what do you mean by dynamical processes question. Sorry. And I think that maybe Dorothea, with her list of different kind of dynamic processes in the body, sort of started to give me some vocabulary for that. But I don't know if you want to comment on that at all.
No, I think she's better qualified to answer that.
Well, I would be happy to comment that I just find it so exciting. Well, first of all, I'm a computer science professor, so I know a lot about simulations, and I always think of what can we do in simulation to just be able to do experiments. The nice thing about simulation is that you can measure things, whereas so it's a very simplified system, but you can measure all the internal tensions and whatever, and it's just really amusing and fun for me to think about. Say we want to simulate that torso model of Tom Fleming's, that it just stuns me that it can move so beautifully when it's just a handful of struts and cables. But if we have a model like that we're simulating, and we want to make up processes like, okay, how are we going to simulate that this thing stretches and yawns every once in a while? Like, what the heck does that even mean? And you can simulate all kinds of things. You could try to simulate that this thing is sitting in front of a computer screen, immobile for long periods, and you know, you can make up algorithms for how things stiffen up with immobility or whatever. Basically, you'd be free to just treat it as sort of an experimental sandbox with this hugely simplified body model, and you can make up more or less processes and have them all interact. And it doesn't take very many processes before it gets to the point where we ourselves can't really predict what's going to happen. Like, it'll be interesting, let the experimentation show us what's going to happen. And then I would hope that eventually there could be interactions with you know, all the manual therapists and trainers and whoever have experience with actual bodies, and then can make hypotheses, and you can go back and try them in the simulation, and you can kind of keep working with it. This is a topic for another day, but I'm very interested in concussion simulations, and like even crash test dummies. We could make much better crash test dummies if they were tensegrity systems. And you know, millions and millions of dollars get put into doing these sorts of things by the automotive industry. You know, and nobody can validate the brain skull models very well to say, you know, what's being simulated here, is that at all realistic compared to how a real brain skull responds to concussions. So I'm hoping that in coming decades we can have good interactions with, because the real physical body is so complex and so hard to study, that we can have useful support in those investigations from simulation environments. And so then in the simulation, you can just make up sets of processes at short and long term. You can have, you know, some processes occur once a month, some occur once a week, some occur circadian rhythms, and some are, you know, nanosecond level, and see how they all interact. And I thought that was very interesting, Doug, what you said, that there were these cases of people who have heart arrhythmias that occur like once a week or something. Our bodies are shaped by all these rhythms that, you know, evolutionarily we come up with rhythmic tides and moon phases and seasons, and, you know, at all different time scales, there's rhythms, and they're reflected in our body. Hey, Joel, do you want to say something? Is Joel still here? He might have had to. Oh, no, you're still here. Unmute yourself. So Joel is having hilarious adventures. He's a physiotherapist, and he's just busy building big tensegrity structures for his clients to play in.
Well, it isn't built yet, but I've had this interest in, because I've been using it and playing with it, you know, for the past, you know, a couple of months. I said, I really want to get a really big one and kind of go inside it and see what happens. You know, kind of like a jungle gym. I work a lot with kids, so trying to find ideas that I can get so they can kind of explore and have that sort of experience with something like that has been a real interest of mine.
Great. So I believe Fabiana has also a question. Fabiana, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Hi, I'm here.
Yeah.
I was thinking about how we can measure the effect of our approach, our hands-on with the clients, the effect on biotensegrity. And because to do some research, sometimes we need to do more things more in a objective way, right? So what do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, it's key to advanced research. it's important to be free thinking and have weird hypotheses and willing to explore all kinds of strange ideas, but it's very important to keep a clear distinction between, you know, this is a hypothesis and a gut feeling and whatever, and then what can we measure objectively. And for myself, I've spent over the past 10 years, I've done a fair bit of reading about fascial networks and fascial adaptivity and biotensegrity and all of that. And I still feel like, personally, I don't understand that stuff well enough to be able to evaluate anything or figure out how to measure it. So I feel like I can do something useful, like okay, if I make a computer simulation of one of Tom Flemmon's models, then I can validate my computer simulation to check that it behaves the same way that his physical model does. But if I make a computer simulation of brain skull under impact, I heard there's no way to validate those models. We know they're probably inaccurate, kind of like, at least if you have weather simulation and you have two different weather simulation programs, you can test after, weather prediction programs. You can test after the fact. You can compare them and say, oh, that one was more accurate with wind speed and this one was more accurate with temperature, because you can measure the temperature. If you have two competing programs that are simulating concussion and trying to say, is a blow to the head this way or that way, which one makes more torque on the brain or whatever, there's no way you can say which of those two models is better. So unfortunately, there's just people publishing more and more about, here's my new model and I think it's good, but no one can validate these things. And I think it's, so unfortunately, if I'm not aware of good ways of being able to measure the biotensegral properties of a body, I think, I mean, there's many other people here. If you have ideas for how to do this, maybe, yes.
This makes me think about what Doug said about just tapping into the emergent qualities, and how when we are functioning more and more optimally, those emergent properties feel more present in our system. Doug, do you want to comment on that? You're muted.
Well, one thing that's just that popped into my mind immediately with the idea of measuring is a couple things Leonid has said over time. And I remember the first time, must have been in DC meeting him, but he said, the only thing you can know for sure is what you read on the force plate. In other words, you can be, you're on a force plate that's this external force, and there can be movement in the body, there can be external forces into the body, but the body itself is indeterminate. We can't know, and that makes it. I think that's an important thing. It's disappointing and frustrating, but I think one of the things is using force plates and find out what we can know for sure, and when that's relevant.
Carol, yes.
Yes, thank you. What a wonderful presentation. I just wanted to comment on this question Fabiana had about measuring and objectivity. We exist in a framework of coming to know that really elevates validity to reproducibility in a dynamic system that's dynamic moment to moment. And there's just no way that we will be able, although I love the concept that Dorothea put forward about algorithms. Yesterday I was and the day before I was in the NIH science presentations on myofascial pain. And so many of the people who were doing computerized simulations and electronics we're looking at muscle as muscle, not as myofascial unit. We're looking at joints as as discrete in and of themselves without looking at the whole web. Nobody talked about the web. The TMJ guy talked about the jaw. And, you know, I just realized how far behind we are in this desire to want to validate what we're doing by reproducibility. And then I think, well, then what's left to us? And for me, at this stage in my career and my life, what's left for me is elevating somebody's history. And if you read Dorothea's CV and you see all her publications and you see her interests and you see what she has done to try to make all of this make sense, and then you read anything or hear anything that Doug says, and his use of imagery and his use of pictures in his mind to demonstrate the hand model, and I can just see him as he's teaching his students. There's something to be said about mastery, about clinical mastery. And it goes beyond just being able to say the right words at the right time and quote the literature and know that Verbontel Lafley was the first systems analyst that I studied back in the 70s. It's way, way beyond that. It's making meaning in the moment to something that makes perfect sense to what we see in front of us and feel inside of us. Now, how do we capture that in scientific literature for meaningfulness? That we are not out of the objectivity phase yet. We're still adolescents in our understanding of science. Once we get to the older soul understanding of science, way after my death for sure, there will be some nod toward, this is clinical mastery. We're going to take this person's word because of all of the data that's available to us to say this person really does know what they're observing as valid.
Thank you, Carol. I'm looking at the time. Doug or Dorothea, do you want to have a quick response to Carol?
I feel like that video that I played at the end of repairing the tensegrity model really kind of demonstrates what you're talking about. I mean, that was an individual case, and there was great knowledge, and it's you can see the evidence, and there's the mastery of the knowledge, but I don't know how you measure that, but it's profound and simple in a way, and clear, and maybe the most important thing.
Thanks, Doug. Dorothea, do you want to comment before I invite Steve on?
I think I've said enough. Okay. Like Doug, I'm hoping that the main role of today's session is to start discussion.
I think we have lots to discuss. So what I would like to do is to invite Steve on to share his comments. I know there are a lot of things that were coming up during the presentations. And then if we have time, Dorothea and Doug, if you wanted to give a quick summary before we sign off of YouTube. Steve, are you there and able to unmute yourself? I don't see you. Maybe he's stepped out for a moment. Wilbur, is it quick? I can't hear you. You have to unmute yourself if you want.
Oh, yes. Hi. Yeah, it's
so
quick.
Just a moment. Okay, great.
Doug and Dorothy, thank you for your presentation. The excellent mind teasing, as I says. I think one of the ways that I think we have to, when we're looking at biotensegrity and the complexity of the system, is that it's a complex system. And if you go back to the constituents of what makes up the whole, and you look at, if you're talking about whether electrons or atoms or quarks or whatever you're talking about, you're going to look and see that the slightest change in any of these individual structures affects the whole system. And this is where the complexity comes up, and where the concept of infinite, I think, adaptation comes up. And this is how I kind of visualize it in my mind. Everything you do is a process for allowing your system to continue adapting and continue performing or continue forming or shaping itself to its existence. Otherwise we won't exist. If the system was rigid, the system would not last. And I think the design of our system, the design of the universe, or the design of living matter is such that it is prone and infinitely will continue to adapt for its existence. I mean, this is how the things like chirality comes up in things of why if we change one atom in an amino acid, it will change the light and we'll get a different color or we get a different shape. And I mean, this is a biological system is designed in that way because the system is complex. Otherwise, we won't survive. I think we have to go back to sort of look at things in that way in terms of adaptability.
Thank you, Wilbur. Doug, do you want to, actually, why don't we ask Dorothea if she has any summary, any final words, any wish to remind us of your wish, how we might take this forward. And then Doug, I will ask you to do a final summary before we have our sponsors and our toasts and such.
Well, my real heartfelt wish would be that Tom Flemons would still be with us, but unfortunately, a few years ago, and I felt very honored. Well, just circumstances happened that I was able to pay attention to Tom much more than anyone else, and we exchanged so much email, and I just felt like this has to be preserved, and I created the Tom Flemons Archive, and I will be speaking in a separate Biotensegrity Party about that in a few weeks. And so my main interest is to see how Tom's models can help advance the understanding of biotensegrity and space robots and all sorts of things. And I just see, yes, it's important to use those models correctly, to not confuse the model with the reality. And Tom always said that, don't confuse the map with the territory. So anytime, you know, people have this confusion, oh, this strut represents a bone or whatever, just keep in mind that these models are huge simplifications, and they're very impressive in how much they can capture with how simple they are, and try to use them as illustrations and sources of inspiration, but don't confuse them with taking them too literally.
Thank you. And even the simulated models as well, as Wilbur was pointing out, but they are a place to go to learn, regardless if they're simplified and models. So Doug, please, will you give us a summary? And then, yeah, go ahead.
I guess my wish going forward is that the concepts around this idea of dynamical diseases that really helps to understand how we're all applying this information is something that we can use to communicate more effectively with each other, understand what we're all doing and how there are different people are doing things that are unique, but also there's a great overlap, and that I think it will be empowering for all of us. And that communication can happen from the theoretical to the application, and from the application back to the theoretical much more effectively if we can use some of these concepts. That's my hope.
That's fabulous. Thank you, Doug. And you know, that's one of the things we like to do here, is to keep that conversation happening. Susan, yeah.
Hey, Chris, I wonder if we could hear from Carol Boggs a little about next week. She's our co-host. Would you mind?
Carol, can you unmute and let us know?
Yes. So next week, we're going to take a look at, is it possible for biotensegrity to have an influence on somatic education practices? And if so, how? We have three people to speak kind of in a round table conversation. Ed Billenshone, Diane Woodruff, and Eleanor Silverstein. So join us next week. It should be interesting.
Yes, thank you. And Ed's here. Eleanor had to go braid her challah, and Diane's usually here, but and Happy New Year to everyone who's celebrating.
Yes, Happy New Year. Thank you. Oh, Steve, you're back again. Do you want to make any final comments before we do our toast? It's been such a fabulous presentation, and I know you've got, you were messaging about a few things. We'd love to hear what you have to say. You're muted. Let me unmute you. Or you have to unmute yourself.
There I go.
There you are.
Yes. Well, let me tell you, I've talked about this dynamical diseases for many years, and I always thought of it as an add-on sort of thing, because, you know, you have to get the basics before you get it. So I didn't think anyone would catch it. But I mean, Doug has just taken this ball and run with it, and he really understands it and has put it into a depth that I've, you know, I never would have thought of in many ways. So I'm really pleased that people are taking some of these basic things that I worked on and taking them into their field, which is really special. And of course, Dorothea and I have corresponded over many, many years, and she's always added interesting things for me that again, she brings in this computer simulation, which I know it has to be a part of this at some point or other, and some in-depth concepts that I'm a mechanic. That's all I am, and I really need other people to take this stuff up and bring it into a much broader thought. So thank you so much for what you've done.
Thank you. Okay, shall we have a quick word from Rachel before our toast? I guess we'll do it this way. First, I want to say that Rachel is our longstanding editor and creator of our weekly newsletter, as well as being here online to support this. Let's all give a hand for Rachel, because we could not do this without you. We have such an amazing team here. Rachel, okay, really quickly, our sponsors, please.
Sure. We want to thank our sponsors, Handspring Publishing. We want to thank Artifact Pro. We want to thank the British Fascia Symposium. We want to thank the First World Congress of Fascia. We want to thank Embodied Biotensegrity.
And thank you, Rachel. And we want to thank all of you. Rachel is here, Rachel Tudor. Lisa Babiak is here. She's also doing tons of behind the scenes work, as is Mariana Barreto.
Thank you.
Susan Lowell, what are we, executive producers now of the Biotensegrity Party. And of course, our honored guests today, Dorothea Blaustein and Doug Johnson. Thank you so much. Dorothea, do you want to close this with a toast?
All right. Let's just toast the sense of community and interdisciplinarity and cooperation that we have in this Biotensegrity community. Thank you for these parties. Cheers.
Thank you. Cheers.
Can I add, and our global resonance, inspired by Doug's words.
Yes.
Cheers, everyone. And thanks also to each and every one of you for showing up week after week, for sharing this. You can always share the YouTube link even after the fact. And we'll see you next week.
Can I make one more quick announcement?
Yeah.
We're looking to do another multilingual tea party in December. So we're hoping that we get at least the 5 languages other than English that we had before, but we're open to other languages. So wherever you are in the world, we're hoping to get at least maybe a French group together. Before we had Spanish, Portuguese, German, Russian, and Greek. So think about that, and wherever you are in the world, if you have a language-based learning community studying biotensegrity, start thinking about that and let us know, because we learned so much before doing that. So we're looking forward to it.
And you can let us know by emailing either me. I've just put my email address in the box. Susan, would you please do that as well in the chat?
Yeah.
And that is set for December, as Susan was saying. So thank you, everyone. We look forward to seeing you next week. Cheers.
Or maybe it's November.